Welcome to Unit 5. We're going to be talking about the Roaring Twenties, a lot of other stuff going on, but we're going to start with Prohibition and the rise of organized crime in the United States. This picture here, by the way, is from I forget if this was a talkie or if it was a silent movie, but this was called The Speakeasy, and a bunch of actors in costumes. These aren't necessarily what folks would actually look like, but it's not too far off. So let's take a look at what they were actually up to. So Prohibition starts with the Temperance Movement, and we talked a little bit about this over the last couple of units, and the general idea is there is a just wild amount of alcohol abuse going on, and this was seen as a sin back then. These days there are still folks that consider it a sort of moral failing, but more and more in modern America, we're taking a look at this, at alcoholism and alcohol abuse as more of a disease. But back then, it was definitely seen as sinful. It was seen as, a sin against God, and there were a whole lot of Christians, Christian progressives, and Christian sort of revivalists kind of happening around this time. So a lot of people, to a lot of people, that's a big reason not to do a lot of drinking. And again, when we talk about religion in this class, I'm not your spiritual advisor. I'm not here to tell you which religion's right or wrong or what you should believe or not believe. We're just going to talk about what they believed and how that affected things. So this really got a lot of people motivated to handle this drinking problem in the U.S. This idea of seeing it as a sin, this idea of, sort of that progressive movement thing of like the government can come in and fix things. And this is in large part led by women. Remember, before these women had the political power to get the right to vote, they were beginning to organize for other social causes. You had the social gospel movement from a couple of units ago, and a lot of those women and other women kind of like see that they can have this effect if they organize and get people motivated behind a cause. And the next big cause, a lot of women, there's men involved in this too, but a lot of women get involved in this cause, and some of them are a little more extreme than others. You have Carrie Nation here, who that's an axe in her hand, in one hand, and a Bible in the other. And her group of temperance sort of warriors, they'd like roll into a bar, and she would just while other people in her group held people off, she'd take that axe to like the barrels of wine and beer and liquor and just destroy the place. So one thing, and there's a lot of things we'll talk about, a lot of the failures of Prohibition, a lot of the reasons it didn't work, a lot of the honestly pretty rough things that happened during Prohibition and come out of Prohibition. But one of the big reasons there was that big push, there's the sinful argument, but also alcohol abuse rates before Prohibition were higher even than like today. 2020 is not done yet, so we don't have an exact number. But the 2019 numbers on alcohol abuse in America are much lower than they were pre-Prohibition. So as much of a problem as we have with alcohol abuse and alcoholism in our country today, it was even worse before Prohibition. That's kind of the one victory. I don't know if you'd call it a big victory or small victory, but it's kind of the one victory of Prohibition, is it did lower alcohol abuse rates in the country. And the most positive legacy of Prohibition, and we'll kind of get into this later, is sort of like the power that these women get when they organize will lead to women's suffrage down the road, which we've already kind of talked about with the progressive era. So we do get the 18th Amendment. Remember, the 18th Amendment is one of those progressive era amendments. It is ratified in 1919, the year before the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. And you can look online for the full text. You're not going to need to memorize the full text. The important text is right here. This prohibits the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. America is now a dry country. Now, there was still rain. It was still there was still precipitation, snow, sleet, ice, fog, etc. But when we're talking in terms of wet versus dry territories, these days, wet, in Texas especially, wet versus dry counties and cities. If a territory is like dry, that means no alcohol is allowed to be sold there. When I was growing up in Arlington, Texas, Arlington was a dry city, a municipality, whatever the official form of the government was. And so you couldn't buy alcohol in Arlington. You were allowed to consume it if you were obviously 21 and of the appropriate age. But when I first went off to college, I was going to I was going to TCC. Sorry, I went to TCC first, then UTA. So when I was going to TCC, I moved into an apartment with some friends, and we were on the Fort Worth-Arlington border, over by like East Chase and 30. And we lived, I mean, we weren't 21 yet, so this didn't really end up mattering to us. But like when I'd go drive to school, when I'd drive to work, I would pass multiple liquor stores right there on the border of Arlington and Fort Worth. It was kind of a way you used to be able to tell where the border between Arlington and Fort Worth was, is, you just see a line of liquor stores, and I was like, oh, we just got to Fort Worth. Because Fort Worth was a wet city. It allowed the sale of alcohol. So with the 18th Amendment passed, America is a dry country. Now you have a nice little political cartoon here. You got that old man in a Bugs Bunny cartoon. That'd be like the old farmer guy or whatever that's trying to get Bugs Bunny off his farm. I don't know. Maybe it's the glasses that gives me that impression. But that's Congress, because they helpfully labeled it for you. The Bone Dry Amendment. That's another term. I mean, there were a bunch of nicknames, I'm sure, for the 18th Amendment. But again, dry, no alcohol. There's that phrasing again. And you have Bacchus and Gambrinus. I'm not super familiar with Gambrinus as like a folk figure, but Bacchus is a god of wine and revelry. I forget if he's the Greek or the Roman one. And they're kicking out these drunkards, these people that are famous for their relationship to alcohol, in mythology and folk tales. So that's the beginning of Prohibition. January 29th, 1919 is the official beginning. Now, not very long after that, and I mean basically immediately after that, these illegal bars open up. And they're called speakeasies. Because back in the day, you had to know the password to get in. You've probably seen these in movies or television shows, or if you watch old Looney Tunes cartoons, they kind of use this setup as a joke plenty of times, where they go up to the door, they do a knock, and then there's that little like sort of eye, like almost like a mailbox thing, but it's just for the eyes, and it kind of opens up, and you see a pair of eyes, and they say like, "What's the password?" And if you know the password, then they'll open the door and let you in. And now you get to come into this like hidden illegal nightclub that sells liquor, has music going, especially music that other venues wouldn't play. A lot of black musicians and black artists, blues, jazz. You even had jazz bands that were integrated, that had white musicians and black musicians, and they weren't allowed to play in a lot of places legally because of segregation laws. So they would go to these speakeasies. The speakeasies are illegal anyway. In a lot of them, there were black people and white people mixing. There were black artists and white artists and musicians sort of mixing. And sort of kind of an interesting sort of thing that goes on there that we don't have time to dig too far into, but it's just kind of something to kind of keep in mind, right? So you have these underground nightclubs. They're the cool place to be, because of the alcohol and the music. And it's also that sort of like thrill of like, ooh, I'm not supposed to be here. Oh, we're not supposed to be doing this. Ooh, the police could show up, and they're often hidden away. You need the password, you need to know where they're at. They're not advertised out in the open necessarily. There were a few in New York that were advertised pretty openly. But that's okay. The mayor and all the police chiefs went to the speakeasy. So they weren't going to get raided. Oh gosh, which it's not on the test or anything, but there was some state where, or some city, some big city where they hired this new police chief to come in and sort of clean up the city, and the police chief starts raiding not only the speakeasies and the nightclubs, but the speakeasies and nightclubs that like the rich people went to, that like police captains and politicians and rich people went to, and the city basically fires him pretty soon after that, because they're like, no, you need to go after the poor people that are breaking the law, not the rich people that are breaking the law. Anyway, this particular picture is a very modern picture, as you can tell from the modern high color, high contrast, high megapixel digital photography here. This is the Scat Jazz Lounge in Fort Worth, Texas. It's in the Sundance Square. When you are of the appropriate age to be going to places like this, and if you want like a pretty cool night, it's a really cool little lounge. They have, obviously drinks, and they have jazz musicians playing all the time, and it's a cool experience because you got to like, you're walking down around Sundance Square in Fort Worth, and you look down this alleyway and you see this neon sign with this arrow. And you go back there, and it's not like a door. You don't have to do the knock and the password. Like they don't do that much of it. But you go down there, and it's an elevator just in the side of a building. You press an elevator down button, and then the elevator doors open up. You get in the elevator, you go down one floor, and then you come out into the jazz lounge. It is a really cool way. Like, obviously this is legal. Obviously this is all above board. In the year 2020 in Sundance Square in Fort Worth, Texas. Nothing's illegal here. There's no funny business going on, Last time I was there, they absolutely asked for ID. So, they're not running any kind of shady thing going on there. So when you're of the appropriate age, and if you want a cool night at a jazz club, not a bad evening. So, and it's just kind of a cool thing of like, ooh, this is kind of what it was like back then. Except back then it was illegal, and you could get arrested, and there was a whole thing to it. So that's the beginning of Prohibition. We have to talk about organized crime in the U.S. Obviously, crime existed in the U.S. before this happened, but there wasn't necessarily like an organization to it. There wasn't necessarily like a mafia kind of thing to it. The mafia was one type of organized crime thing. It wasn't the only one, and it certainly wasn't the only one. So we have an increase in demand for illegal alcohol and other illegal things, but alcohol is the main one. And so where there's, basic capitalism, right? Where there's a demand, people will pay money for this. Sellers will come into the market to sell, to make money in this way. And just because it's illegal doesn't mean people aren't going to sell, doesn't mean Americans aren't going to make money. And so we have these rum runners and bootleggers. And some were both, some were one, some were the other. But basically rum runners were folks that would head across the border to Mexico, usually, sometimes Canada. And they would load up their cars full of, rum, or, really any kind of alcohol. Rum was cheap and plentiful and easy to transport. Compared to some other types of alcohol at the time. So rum was the common one, but they'd have vodka, whatever liquors you were looking for, wine even. And they would, smuggle it across the border. And this is actually where, this is kind of where NASCAR comes from. The cars that they would modify and make, better and faster and able to outrun the police cars and get through that and outrun, competing rum runners. It's kind of where the idea for NASCAR came from, and the idea of souping up the cars and doing these races. Look into that history. It's pretty interesting. And then bootleggers are sort of the homegrown folks. These are the people making moonshine. These are the people sort of illegally brewing their own stuff. And that had its own dangers. Like the competition and other, crime elements willing to, violently defend their territory, violently expand their territory. You also just have the danger of making alcohol. In big professional factories, there's very little risk because, it's all done above board. They can, they have enough money for the appropriate safety measures. And, folks that, these days in 2020, we're talking about like micro brewing and like, I had a friend that was into it a few years back, and he had like a small little kit, and there wasn't really any danger to that. But like, if you're trying to produce a lot of alcohol very quickly, and you don't have the safety equipment and all the rest of that stuff, alcohol stills can be kind of dangerous. I mean, like they didn't explode all the time, but like they could, and that would be a bit of a danger. So you have these organized crime figures starting to come up. This is a photograph from an Al Capone movie. The actual year from the Al Capone movies in the citations, as well as the actor playing him. But Al Capone, right, is kind of the big name from this time period. And remember, they didn't get him on any of his organized crime stuff. They got him for not paying his taxes. The IRS is going to get what's theirs, so pay your taxes. So not only do we have alcohol off the table, unless you got money, not only do we have organized crime running around, we also have this growing income inequality in the U.S. Now, obviously, in the U.S., we've always had rich folks and poor folks and the people in between. And in a capitalist free market society, that's part of the design. You hope for a strong middle class. You get the few people that are doing very well, and then there's people that aren't going to be doing very well. And any economic system is going to have folks that are doing better off than others. Capitalism's no different. So, but in the 1920s, things start getting pretty ridiculous, right? You have, I think the top one's from Tennessee. I mean, more information in the citations as always. But the top one, I believe, is from Tennessee. And you have these two kids at a water pump, a communal water pump for that whole, well, I'd call it a street, but there's not a street there. Like, it's just a dirt road. And there's one car kind of off in the background, but barefoot, obviously not the highest quality clothes. I mean, they're making by. They're doing good. I'm not saying, there's nothing wrong with living like that, but like that's definitely not a lot of money. And then right below in that picture, you have, I don't think this one was from a movie. I think this is just like a photograph taken kind of by some high society ladies about to head out for the evening. And so they're getting more and more and more of the share of the money. And what's this? When do you guys read the book? You've probably read this book by now in your school career. If you haven't, you'll be reading it very soon. The Great Gatsby. Not a bad book. There's decent movie versions of it too. The most recent one, obviously, with Leonardo DiCaprio. So you have the stock market surging upwards. So the people that are invested in the stock market are making more and more and more and more money, which is, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer thing that's going on. So not only are the rich getting richer, the rich are getting way richer, which is a whole thing. Now you start getting flappers, which is the name for women kind of like that at the bottom. They've got that short hair. These aren't the traditional flappers. Their dresses are a little too long. Flappers had short hair, short dresses. For the time. Like, in these days, I don't know if they'd be considered super short as far as dresses go. But for the time, they were showing a lot of skin. They were showing their shoulders and their whole arms. And, the dresses might have a pretty low back to them, and they have a short dress. And they're going out at night, and they're going to parties, and they're drinking alcohol, and they're smoking cigars and cigarettes, and they're hanging around boys without a male chaperone. So this is kind of that, not the starting point in U.S. history, but certainly sort of the biggest, most visible surge among young women for an independence that their, mothers didn't have, their grandmothers didn't have, saying that they wanted a life outside of just marriage and raising a family, or at least to go do some of that stuff before they settle down and get married and raise a family. So flappers are a big deal. Like people, the older generations kind of start flipping out about it. You've all experienced this in your lives, right? I'm sure all of you can think of things that is perfectly normal for your generation, but your parents are, flip out about it and forget about your grandparents. I mean, TikTok as a concept, but I'm sure you can think of some specific examples, that talk about it with your friends and people your age, and everyone's like, yeah, it's totally fine and normal. It's not a big deal. I don't get why our parents are all angry. When I was growing up, that was like heavy metal music and rap. Parents were like, oh my gosh, what is this? And now, it's not very controversial at all. Now, this is an agent of change in American history right now. The automobile. There is no single invention that has changed American culture more than the car. I know the internet's happened. I know there's been a lot of big inventions since then that have had a big and large effect, and maybe one day the internet will kind of take the title away from the automobile, but not yet, I don't think. I think the automobile, if you had, I don't know, we could have a debate about that sometime, I'm sure. But the automobile helps create the idea of the suburbs. So you could have individual cars and just have a huge area of just residential zone, and you'd have to drive 10 or 15 minutes to even get to a grocery store, 30 to 45 minutes or more even to get to a city. And so if you're in the middle class, you don't have to live in the city anymore. You can sort of spread out. And so now we get the sort of urban sprawl. And you can go live in the suburbs, but keep your job in the city. So the cities become even more of a stark contrast between the rich and the poor, because you have the poor people that work in the city that can't afford cars and can't afford to leave the city and come back every day. And then you have the super rich who live in the super nice parts of the city that are rich enough that they don't need to go out to the suburbs. So you end up with the middle class abandoning the cities, partly because of the car and convenience thing, partly because of white flight, which we'll talk about later in the unit. And another big deal is young people can go on dates without permission from their parents. They can go further to sort of hang out together as big groups of teenagers and young adults without their parents knowing about it. Or if their parents knew about it, there wasn't much they could do about it. And obviously, that's not a problem for any of you. You've never gotten in trouble from your parents because you left in a car. We won't get into it. I trust you guys. But this is a huge game changer in American culture. Hard to overstate it. Incredibly hard to overstate just how big of a deal the car is. It allows rum running to be a thing. It allows speakeasies and illegal alcohol to be sold, and the police to chase them. It's a huge, huge deal. It affects basically every part of our society. And if you've never been outside of America, there's a lot of countries in the world where cars are not the thing they are in America. The automobile is a very American concept. And there's plenty of cars out in other countries, I'm not saying that. But the car is a very, very American concept. And our country has been built around access to cars. Most of you live in Texas, right? Especially if you live around here in Northwest ISD and in some of these sort of suburban rural areas, you need a car. It's not I'd like to have a car. You need a car to get around, to get a job, to get anything, right? So the 21st Amendment, there's struggle for more than a few years about, 1919 to 1933. A little over a decade, not quite 15 years, about alcohol. Should it be allowed to be sold? Should it not? And on December 5th, 1933, they passed the 21st Amendment. I think this is the entire thing. There might be a tiny little bit more but I think this is basically it. The 18th article of amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed. So this repeals the 18th Amendment. This allows alcohol to be bought and sold and manufactured and consumed once again in America. And this, sorry, I don't know where I'm at on the screen. Over here? Is that him? Anyway. This political cartoon really shows the main argument against prohibition that was going around in America at the time. So you have the law and justice, one police officer with one pistol against organized crime who has, I think that's supposed to be chainmail? I don't know, or just coins, like armor literally made out of coins. Organized crime, just a big money belt. Pardons is on the wall behind him, so a lot of these organized crime figures, they could get pardons by the governor or the mayor or wherever the crime was taking place, because the governor was at the speakeasy, the governor was at the illegal nightclub drinking alcohol, and that's being provided by these organized crime figures. Profits from the bootlegs, money to hire the best lawyers, money to bribe politicians, money to bribe jurors. What's that? Blood money? Bond money, sorry. I mean, I'm sure there's blood money somewhere in there, but bond money to get out of jail on bonds. So here's organized crime making all this money, enough money to own politicians, to own juries, to own lawyers, to just walk out of jail when they get caught. And not only is he armored up, he has a very large weapon, much bigger, much more effective than that little pistol that's not doing anything. And it's that giant axe, pike, polearm thing called gang rule, and it's just dripping with blood. So the main argument against prohibition is not, we should be free to drink alcohol. It's, look at the problems prohibition is causing. And so they end up getting rid of it. So what? Who cares? Who cares that prohibition was a thing? It brought organized crime in, and there was a huge rise in income inequality in cars and flappers and the rest. This is basically 100 years ago. Mr. Trask, why would this even matter? Why have we been learning about this? Sorry, you're probably not whining. That was unfair of me. Why are we even learning about this, Mr. Trask? Gee. Also unfair. Sorry. It's a good question. Well, you should ask, why does this matter? Because history does matter, right? So the main legacy of prohibition is that it failed. 2020 also, the year's not over yet. All 50 states you can buy, sell, consume, manufacture alcohol. Now there's areas within states where there's limits and laws and stuff. I think these days in Arlington, I haven't lived in Arlington in a little while, but I think these days in Arlington you can buy beer and wine. I don't think you can buy liquor yet. So there's still that kind of crossing over the border into Fort Worth liquor store kind of line in the Arlington Fort Worth borders. Now, one of the positive legacies is we do have a lower rate of alcohol abuse after prohibition than we did before it. One of the really bad legacies of prohibition is once alcohol is legalized again, well, there's no real money in it for organized crime because it's illegal to buy and sell. You don't need rum runners going into Mexico to buy a whole bunch of illegal rum and outrun the police to get it back in, because you can just buy it and get a truck to deliver it to your bar that's now legal and legitimate. Right? It's fine. So you have all these gangsters, all these organized crime people, Al Capone, those kind. And they need a new form of revenue. They need new monetary streams coming in. So now they're bringing in harder drugs. And we'll get into that as we go. Kidnapping, human trafficking, assassinations, not that they were cool and chill and non-violent when they were just doing alcohol. There were a lot of murders, there were a lot of competition, a lot of running gunfights in the streets between rival gangs and the police and other it's a whole big mess. And after prohibition is over, now they don't know what to do for money, so now they start trying a whole bunch of other things, which, as dangerous as rampant alcohol abuse and alcoholism is, maybe harder drugs, kidnapping, and human trafficking is worse than alcohol. Now, rum running, now this is allegedly, I'm going to put a big old allegedly in front of this. Allegedly. The Kennedy family may have made a lot of its money from rum running. Now, John F. Kennedy wasn't the one that did it, but like his grandpa, the folks that came before John F. Kennedy and the Kennedy family might have been a part of rum running and making a lot of money that way. And that might be where a decent chunk of the Kennedy fortune comes from. Allegedly. There's a lot of disagreement among historians. I cannot present this to you as a fact, not just like, oh, it's not a fact, wink, it really happened. Like, there are competing, historical theories on this, competing historical evidence on this. But if it's true, then Prohibition may have basically been indirectly responsible for giving us President John F. Kennedy in 1960 and the whole, Camelot era of the White House and the New Frontier and, Kennedy versus Nixon, just all of that. Lyndon B. Johnson as president, that might have not have happened without Kennedy. So if that's true, I'm not trying to say anything bad about the Kennedy family. I'm just saying, like, things like this can have a long-term effect generations later. For instance, Shaquille O'Neal didn't come from a rich family. He is now very rich, and his family is going to have plenty of money, and they're going to be comfortable, and they're not going to, they're going to be good as far as money goes, probably for the rest of their lives, their kids' lives, their grandkids' lives, like generations, right? So you might have grown up, maybe down the line you're grown, you're an old person, you've got kids, grandkids, maybe of your own, depending on, your plans in life. Don't want to make any assumptions, right? And you might see a President O'Neal getting elected, not Shaquille, but grandkid, some member of that family, and you'll be kind of laughing and be like, oh, the O'Neal, yeah, I remember Shaquille, and the grandkids, great, whatever, be like, who's that? And you're like, oh, it was a basketball player. The whole reason that family has any money is because their great grandpa was huge and a great basketball player. They're gonna be like, whatever, granddad, whatever, grandma. Anyway, you'll get it. You'll be old at some point. You'll have to deal with that. We all will. So like, it's just interesting to see that. And there's a million, people that have come from pretty rough circumstances and made it rich in a million ways. Shaquille O'Neal is just one example that you could use. Imagine like, no, I don't even know. Imagine a musician who makes millions of dollars, and they really rise up, and then they have some kids, and then that money that was started by a musical career eventually determines who's going to be senators and presidents and business leaders. Interesting to see what's going to happen coming up. And what goes up must come down is the other legacy of the Roaring Twenties. Because the Roaring Twenties, we've got the really rough situation of World War I, right? Like, really bad, really bleak, really, we went over it, right? And then, like, the Roaring Twenties comes out of World War I and just, like, shoots upward. The stock market's going great. We got these parties. We got these, automobiles now. We've got all these, like, new crazy things, and we're just going up and up and up, and America's on an upward path. And then the Great Depression. The stock market just falls apart because, when the stock market was started, it was built on some pretty solid foundations, but over the years, some of those foundations kind of went away, and it was sort of ended up being sort of a house of cards. And we'll get into that when we get to the Great Depression. And houses of cards can look fantastic, and you can build, honestly, I've seen some very skilled people build houses of cards, and they can get massive, and they can be just gigantic, just sculptures of cards, but like you pop one card out and in the right place and just it all falls apart. And so we end up with the Great Depression. We end up with record unemployment. We end up with just terrible, terrible conditions. And we'll talk about all that when we get to it. Sorry. And there's a lot of government corruption that happens in the Roaring Twenties. We're going to be talking about that this unit, actually. And not that Americans were ever like super trusting of our government, right? Like the whole reason our country started is we rebelled against a government we didn't trust. But for the most part, Americans trusted their government. We might disagree with them. We might, kind of be a little suspicious of them occasionally. But for the most part, we trusted our government to do what they needed to do. But there's a ton of scandals that are just going to rock the federal government, a bunch of state governments, and it's going to just put this idea in Americans' heads of, oh, maybe we can't trust our elected officials. Maybe we can't trust our government. And you look at that now, and in 2020, that's a very common thing that Americans would tell you is they don't trust the government. They don't trust our elected officials. You go back to 1980s when I was a kid. Ronald Reagan was president, and he would go around saying, like, don't trust the government. I forget his thing, but it's like, the scariest words in the English language are like, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That was the president of the United States would say that, So like, out of this, we get the Great Depression and all the things that's going to cause. We'll talk about the legacies of the Great Depression when we get to it. It's going to affect things that you would never guess it would affect. And this distrust of the government and the systems that make it up, and that plays into politics even today. October 23rd, 2020, we got an election in a week and a half, not even 2 weeks, like a week and a half. Right? Next week. Yeah, like a week and a half. No time at all. We have an election. And if you're watching this, around when it's being recorded, you know exactly what kind of stuff is being thrown back and forth in this election. And a big part of it is, can we trust the government? At the debate that was on last night, I will forgive you 100% if you didn't watch it. It was, once again, two old people yelling at each other and a moderator desperately trying to get them back on topic. She did actually a better job than some of the other moderators I've seen lately. So good job, her. But that's a tough job. And one of the things they were yelling back and forth at each other about is, if a vaccine is going to come out, how will the American people know to trust it? Because our trust in our government and institutions is at this all-time low in 2020. And that had its start 100 years ago during this time period. So we'll get to all this. We'll talk about it. Later in this unit, we're going to talk about the Harlem Renaissance. We're going to talk about the presidencies of like Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding up there with William McKinley for best eyebrows on a president. Also probably our most corrupt president we've ever had. Probably. More than likely. The Harding administration was super corrupt. Like, he dies just a couple of years into it. He doesn't even get a full term. And his presidency is more corrupt than basically any other presidency we've ever had. And like, corruption keeps coming out long after he's dead. Like, he dies, and then there's still corruption to be figured out from. Yeah, he wasn't assassinated. He died of like a heart attack, probably. So we'll get to that. We'll get to all those things. We're getting to things that are super close to our modern world. These things we're talking about in this unit are going to have a direct effect on the modern world. My grandmother was born in 1918. So, like, I've spoken to people that were alive during this time period. If you've, depending on sort of exactly where your generations are at in your family, a grandparent or a great-grandparent may have been alive during this time period. And if you were lucky enough to get to know them, you've spoken to somebody that was alive during this time period. So, like, this is a direct line. You can draw direct lines from the things we're going to study this unit to what's happening today. So, I'm excited. Hope you're excited. We'll see you next time. I don't know how to end these videos yet.